d4, queen's pawn opening, opening line. The queen's pawn opening move is somewhat slower than the popular e4 because white will not be able to castle for 3 more moves. Its advantage is that it gives white more control over tactical surprises and often provides more lasting initiative and pressure. Knight f6, Indian defense, opening line. The immediate development of the knight is the most supple response to the queen's pawn opening, allowing transposition into virtually every type of defense at black's disposal. Knight f3, Indian defense, Tory attack, opening line. The Tory attack is characterized by white's second and third moves, Knight f3 and Bishop g5. White avoids several defenses that would be possible after 2c4 and prepares a kingside attack along the lines of the collie opening. g6, Indian defense, Tory attack, pseudo-king's Indian, opening line. This is one of several common ways to enter the king's Indian defense posture for black. Yet to be decided are the related defenses, the Yugoslav variation, levering the center with c5, or Benoni defense, or Grunfeld defense. Bishop g5, Indian defense, Tory attack, pseudo-king's Indian, Tory attack, opening line. Bishop g7, out of opening book, enables the short castle. Knight b d2, castle kingside. c3, d6, e4, c5, d takes c5, d takes c5. Black wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Bishop c4 blocks black's pawn at c5 and makes way for a castle to the kingside. Knight c6, castle kingside. Queen c7, queen e2, h6, attacks white's bishop at g5. Bishop e3, moves it to safety and threatens black's pawn at c5. b6, removes the threat on black's pawn at c5. h3, bishop b7, bishop a6, blocks black's pawn at a7. Rook a d8, bishop takes b7, queen takes b7. Black wins a bishop for a bishop. Material is even. a4, rook d7, bishop f4, rook f d8, rook f e1, knight e8, knight c4, blocks black's pawn at c5. Knight c7, takes the knight away from the edge of the board. Bishop takes c7, threatens black's rook at d8. Queen takes c7, protects black's rook at d8. Black wins a bishop for a knight. Material is even. e5, rook d5, e6, f5, h4, rook d3, h5, threatens black's pawn at g6. Queen f4, attacks White's knight at c4. Knight e3 moves it out of immediate jeopardy. g5 moves it out of immediate danger. Rook a d1. Rook takes d1. Rook takes d1. Queen e4 pins White's knight at e3 and threatens White's pawn at e6. Rook takes d8 check protects White's pawn at e6 and White's pawn at a4 and checks Black's king. Knight takes d8 protects Black's king and forks White's pawn at e6 and White's pawn at a4. Knight d2 threatens Black's queen. Queen takes a4. Knight takes f5 removes the threat on White's pawn at e6, threatens Black's pawn at e7, and isolates Black's pawn at e7. White wins 2 rooks and a pawn for 2 rooks and a pawn. Material is even. Bishop f8 protects Black's pawn at e7. Queen d3. Slightly better is Knight e4. Cogitating. The chess master recommends knight to e4. You move your knight to e4. Black counters with the queen to b3, which blocks your pawn at b2. You move your knight to f6, which protects your pawn at e6 and checks Black's king. Black answers with pawn, captures knight, which removes the threat on Black's king. You move your pawn to e7, which forks Black's knight and Black's bishop and adds a promote threat at e7. Black answers with bishop takes pawn, which protects Black's knight and removes the promote threat at e7. Your queen takes bishop, which threatens mate. Queen to g7. And triple forks Black's pawn at a7, Black's pawn at f6, and Black's knight. Black counters with queen to d1, which protects Black's knight, Black's pawn at a7, Black's pawn at f6, and Black's pawn at h6, and forks your king and your pawn at h5. You move your king to h2, which moves it out of check, threatens to mate. Queen to g7. And triple forks Black's pawn at a7, Black's pawn at f6, and Black's pawn at h6. Black responds with queen takes pawn, which removes the threat on Black's pawn at a7, Black's pawn at f6, and Black's pawn at h6, and checks your king. You move your king to g3, which moves it out of check, threatens mate. Queen to g7, and triple forks Black's pawn at a7, Black's pawn at f6, and Black's knight. Black responds by moving the knight to f7, which moves it out of immediate jeopardy. Your queen captures pawn at f6, which threatens to mate. Queen to g7. Black counters with the king to f8. You move your queen to e7, which forks Black's pawn at a7 and Black's king. Black is forced to move king to g8, which moves it out of check. Your queen takes pawn at a7, which attacks Black's pawn at b6. As a result of this line of play, you win a bishop and 2 pawns for a knight and 2 pawns. Additionally, the mobility of black's pieces is somewhat decreased. Also, the development of black's pawns is a little weaker. Lastly, the pressure on black's king is somewhat increased. Queen d3. Slightly better is knight e4. Queen d1. Check. Pins white's knight at d2, protects black's knight and forks white's king and white's pawn at h5. King h2. Moves it out of check and threatens black's knight. Queen takes h5, check. Removes the threat on black's knight and checks white's king. Black wins. King g1. Moves it out of check and attacks black's knight. Queen d1, check. Pins white's knight at d2, removes the threat on black's knight and checks white's king. King h2. Moves it out of check and attacks black's knight. Knight takes e6. Moves it off the edge. Black wins a pawn. Knight g3. Slightly better is queen d7. Analyzing. The chess master recommends queen to d7. You move your queen to d7, which forks black's pawn at a7 and black's knight. Black responds by moving the knight to f4, which moves it to safety. You move your pawn to g3, which threatens black's knight. Black counters with queen to h5, which protects black's pawn at a7 and black's knight and checks your king. You move your king to g1, which moves it out of check and forks black's pawn at a7 and black's knight. Black responds by moving the knight to e2, which moves it to safety, removes the threat on black's pawn at a7 and checks your king. You move your king to f1, which moves it out of check and attacks black's pawn at a7. Black counters with the knight to c1, which threatens checkmate. Queen to h1. You move your queen to e6, which checks black's king and blocks black's pawn at e7. Black counters by moving the king to h7, which moves it out of check and threatens mate. Queen to h1. You move your king to g2. Black responds by moving queen to g6, which threatens your queen. You move your queen to d5, which moves it to safety. Black counters by moving the knight to e2, which moves it off the edge. As a result of this line of play, your attack potential is somewhat increased, and black's attack potential is somewhat decreased. In addition, the pressure on black's king is slightly increased. Knight g3. Slightly better is queen d7. Knight f4. Attacks white's queen. Queen c4. Check. Moves it to safety, checks black's king, and blocks black's pawn at c5. e6. Protects black's king and threatens white's knight at d2. Knight d e4. Moves it to safety. Bishop g7. b4. Queen d5. Frees black's pawn at e6 from the pin and threatens white's queen. Queen a6. Moves it to safety, attacks black's pawn at a7, and blocks black's pawn at a7. C takes b4, creates a passed pawn on a7, and isolates white's pawn at c3. Black wins a pawn. Queen c8, check, checks black's king. King h7, moves it out of check. C takes b4, white wins a pawn. h5. Queen c2. King h6. f3. Bishop e5. King h1. Queen d3, threatens white's queen. Queen c6, leads to h4, knight f5, check, king h7, king h2, knight g6, check, g3, e takes f5, knight takes g5, check, king g7, queen b7, check, king h6, knight f7, check, king h5, knight takes e5, h takes g3, check, king takes g3, f4, check, king h3, knight takes e5, which wins a bishop and 2 pawns for 2 knights and a pawn. Better is queen takes d3, leading to knight takes d3, b5, g4, f takes g4, h takes g4, knight e2, king g6, king g1, king f5, knight f2, knight c5, king f1, g3, knight d1, which wins a queen and a pawn for a queen and a pawn. Queen d1, check, leads to king h2, bishop d4, which does not result in any captures. Better is h4, leading to knight f5, check, king h7, king h2, knight g6, check, g3, e takes f5, knight takes g5, check, king g7, queen b7, check, king h6, knight f7, check, king h5, knight takes e5, h takes g3, check, king takes g3, f4, check, king h3, knight takes e5, which wins 2 knights and a pawn for a bishop and 2 pawns. King h2, moves it out of check. Queen d8, leads to knight f5, check, king g6, knight e3, knight e2, check, king h1, knight d4, queen a4, g4, king g1, bishop f4, knight c4, queen c7, which results in no exchange of material. Better is knight g6, leading to queen takes e6, queen e1, queen f5, bishop f4, queen h3, h4, b5, bishop takes g3, check, knight takes g3, queen takes g3, check, queen takes g3, h takes g3, check, king takes g3, knight f4, king f2, which wins a queen and 2 knights for a queen, a bishop, and 2 pawns. King h1 leads to g4. Knight f5, check. King h7. Queen b7, check. King g6. Knight e7, check. King h6. King h2. Knight g6, check. f4. Queen takes e7. Queen takes e7. Bishop takes f4, check. g3. Bishop takes g3, check. King takes g3. Knight takes e7, which wins a queen and a bishop for a queen, a knight, and 2 pawns. Better is h4 leads to knight f5, check. King h5. Knight f d6. Bishop takes d6. Knight takes d6. Knight d5. b5. Queen e7. King g1. g4. f takes g4, check. King takes g4. Knight e4, which wins a knight and a pawn for a bishop and a pawn. Better is g4 leading to knight f5, check. King h7. Queen b7, check. King g6. Knight e7, check. King h6. King h2. Knight g6, check. f4. Queen takes e7. Queen takes e7. Bishop takes f4, check. g3. Bishop takes g3, check. King takes g3. Knight takes e7, which wins a queen, a knight, and 2 pawns for a queen and a bishop. Black had a 1 game before this error, but it was not costly. White later resigned. Knight f5, check, moves it to safety and checks Black's king. King g6, moves it out of check and threatens White's knight at f5. Knight e3, moves it to safety. Queen c7, threatens White's queen. Queen e8, check. Slightly better is knight c4. Evaluating. The chess master recommends knight to c4. You move your knight to c4. Black counters with the queen to g7. You move your queen to e8, which checks Black's king. Black responds with king to h7, which moves it out of check. You move your king to h2. Black responds by moving the bishop to c3, which attacks your pawn at b4. You move your pawn to b5, which moves it to safety. Black answers with bishop to d4. You move your knight at c4 to d6. Black replies by moving the pawn to g4. Your pawn takes pawn, which creates a passed pawn on g4 and isolates Black's pawn at h4. Black counters with queen takes pawn, which threatens mate. Queen captures pawn. You move your queen to e7, which forks Black's king and Black's pawn at a7. Black responds by moving bishop to g7, which threatens mate. Queen captures pawn and removes the threat on Black's king. As a result of this line of play, you win a pawn for a pawn. In addition, your mobility is somewhat increased, and the mobility of Black's pieces is slightly decreased. Also, the development of Black's pawns is somewhat weakened. Queen e8, check. Slightly better is knight c4. King g7, moves it out of check. Knight g4. White gives Black a forced mate opportunity. Much better is knight d1, knight g4 leads to queen c1, check, king h2, knight e2, check, knight takes e5, queen g1, check, king h3, knight f4, check, king g4, queen takes g2, check, knight g3, queen takes g3, and checkmate. This move lost the game for white. Black saw the mating combination, and white resigned. Queen c1, check. Black plots a mate in 5. Removes the threat on black's pawn at g5 and checks white's king. Leads to king h2, knight e2, check, knight takes e5, queen g1, check, king h3, knight f4, check, king g4, queen takes g2, check, knight g3, queen takes g3, and mate. King h2. Forced moves it out of check and forks black's pawn at g5 and black's bishop. Knight e2, check. Black has a mate in 4. Protects black's pawn at g5 and checks white's king with a discovered check. Leads to knight takes e5, queen g1, check, king h3, knight f4, check, king g4, queen takes g2, check, knight g3, queen takes g3, and mate. Knight takes e5. Protects white's king, threatens black's pawn at e6, and blocks black's pawn at e6. White wins a bishop. Queen g1, check. Black has a mate in 3. Protects black's pawn at e6 and checks white's king. Leads to king h3, knight f4, check, king g4, queen takes g2, check, knight g3, queen takes g3, and checkmate. King h3. Forced moves it out of check, forks black's pawn at e6 and black's pawn at g5 and blocks black's pawn at h4. Queen h1, check. Removes the threat on black's pawn at e6 and black's pawn at g5 and checks white's king. White resigns.